started. Turn in your hymn books, if you would, to number 175. 175, Standing on the Promises. When you find it, if you can, go ahead and stand. We'll sing all four verses. 175. Either tonight or tomorrow, anything that's come in, unless it's marked otherwise. Tonight or tomorrow night, we'll go to our speaker, Dr. Phil Stringer. We are fortunate to be able to have him. He is out in our neck of the woods for just a very little bit of time. He was in Ohio yesterday. He'll be in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, 2 hours away on Wednesday night before he heads back home. He has to get home on Friday, just in time to leave Saturday. And he keeps a very busy itinerant schedule, so we're very fortunate to have him the 2 nights that we do. So please make sure that you see to that the laborer is worthy of his hire. Also, we're thankful that the Deschongs are here from Connellsburg, Pennsylvania, up at Bible Baptist. Pastor Leslie was with us, I believe, for missions conference.
Yes.
And hopefully are going to be able to make it sometime tomorrow night, Lord willing. They had a previous commitment for tonight. Maybe Dr. Angelini, that you folks may know and remember from having been here and a chiropractor. He also goes to that church, and there's a possibility that he'll be able to make it. So I'll be inviting guests and visitors. We've asked Dr. Stringer to speak on 2 specific topics in regards to education and socialism is not biblical. And as I mentioned yesterday and before, he is possibly the authority on those 2 topics that I know anywhere. And we're thrilled to be able to have him. So make sure you speak to him after the service if you have not already. 177 in your hymn books, 177. Thy word have I hid in my heart.
That I might not sin.
Turn in your hymn books to 178, 178. Your hymn book's open, it's right across the page. The Bible stands. When you find it, go ahead and stand. We will sing all 4 verses before Dr. Stringer comes. 178, the Bible stands. Stringer has been a very good friend to my dad and to myself. He is a well-educated, well-learned man. The first time first time I ever spoke for him, maybe the second time. He was in the Philippines, and I was up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, speaking for Dr. Brown, and he asked me to cover for him. And I was to preach on a Wednesday night. And the instructions were to get to the office, and that Tina, the secretary, would let me into the office. And he said, in the afternoon, there will be people starting to pour in. He pastored in the inner city of Chicago on the north side for 10 years? 11 years. Not far from Wrigleyville, in the area of Ravenswood. And sure enough, shortly after 4 o'clock, people started pouring in. The public transportation system is not incredibly reliable, so instead of taking a chance on getting home, not getting to church on time, people of all nations poured into that church. But when I sat down in his study, it was given to me to be able to have some quiet time and study. I looked up, and on this wall, not placed in an obvious place, were some of his college degrees. And he is very well learned. He was head of a Bible college down in Florida for some time, pastored in Chicago for 11 years, and now is vice president of Day Spring Bible College. We met him when we were speaking together with Dean Burton Society from years gone by. And if I recall correctly, my dad introduced himself some way like this. We share similar enemies.
Yeah.
And if they don't like you so much, maybe we have something in common. And this man has sacrificed a lot to stand for the King James Scriptures. He and Dr. Brown co-founded the KJBRC and have carried that on for now 10 years and have done a very, very good job with it. They came up with the idea of the Defender of the Scriptures Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award. And for those of you who don't know, Pastor Reno was the first one to get it. And that was their idea. I had nothing to do with it, but I had to keep the secret until 5 minutes before it was presented to him there in Wisconsin. Dr. Stringer's been a good friend to myself and Pastor Reno, and we're thrilled he could be with us tonight. One thing I forgot to mention, he has some of his books back there on the table. I would highly recommend you look especially at the historical books, the history books. Those have been highly in demand. I know some of Rachel's family have bought them and talked to me when I've been out in Illinois about how much they enjoy them. Very powerful, very helpful. Dr. Stringer.
Thank you, Brother Reno and Pastor Reno. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I mean, it's a joy to be here. I say that everywhere, but I mean, it's really a joy to be here. Last time I tried to get here 2 years ago. Didn't get here. I was on my way to a meeting in Ohio, the same meeting I was just at, and then was going to come over here, and got hit by a semi-truck. Plowed into 5 cars, of which I was one. And I got to tell you, that probably came as the biggest surprise of my life. We were stopped at construction traffic. Whatever reason, the truck driver didn't see us and plowed right into us going full speed. I was just sitting there thinking, we were right outside my hometown of Indianapolis. And it was noon. I said, you know, when we get going again, I'm going to pull off here in Indianapolis to get lunch. And every restaurant you can think of is in Indianapolis, and I know where they all are. I was just thinking, I can go anywhere I want for lunch. And then the car started crumbling all around me. And I ended up having lunch in the emergency room at the hospital. And my car popped out of line, went down a hill. Long story short, they get me up the hill, they put me in an ambulance, and I get talking to the nurse. Turns out the nurse is a Christian. And she's explaining to me what's just happened. There were 2 people killed. And she said, apparently, God is not done with you yet. So then they take me to the emergency room in the hospital. And the emergency room nurse was a Christian. She talked with me a bit and said, apparently God still has some things for you to do yet. Then the emergency room doctor came in. Turned out he was a Christian. He was really an incredible blessing. And he said, what you do is more important than what I do. He said, I fix people up and they still die. He said, what you do lasts for eternity. Great man and a great encouragement. He said, apparently, God's not done with you yet. After a bit, my son called. He said, Dad, he said, I guess God's just not ready for you to quit yet. A little bit later, my pastor called and said, Dr. Stringer, said, apparently God's not done. with you. And I had it posted on Facebook quickly so my friends would know I wasn't one of the people killed in the accident. And in the little town I was in the hospital at, I have a friend who's an evangelist, and he read it. He was right over the hospital. Actually, we had just been in the same meeting together in southern Indiana. And he sat with me until my wife could drive down from the Chicago area, and it was a great blessing. And he said, well, apparently, God still has things for you to do. So I've been operating on that assumption ever since then, that God is not done with me yet. And one of my goals has been to get everywhere that I had to cancel in those weeks after that. And so when I say I'm really glad to be here, I mean nothing exciting happened to me on the way here today. So I am really glad to be here. We're going to talk a little bit about Christian education and secular education. And I'm going to address some things to you from a paper I've written. I need to explain this. When I was 17 years old, I was sitting in youth camp, and the preacher was preaching on full-time Christian service. And I became aware of God stirring in my heart about that. The very next night, I went forward on the invitation to surrender to full-time Christian work. But what I surrendered to was I believe God had called me to be a preacher, and God had called me to be a history teacher. It was a package deal for me. And that's what I surrendered to. And I went into my senior year of high school, and I think, what am I going to do? And I decided I would go to Bible college to train to be a preacher, because it'd be easier to get self-educated in history and wiser than it is to get self-educated in the Bible. So God honored and blessed and has given me, from the moment I graduated from Bible college till now, opportunities to address history from a Christian perspective. Let me say very quickly on this. First, people often respond to this kind of thing by saying, well, you're against public school people. I am a public school person. I went to kindergarten in public school. I went to elementary school in public school. Went to junior high and high school in public school. The last thing I am is against public school young people. Again, I am one. And I honor those teachers who've tried to make a difference in individual lives within that system. And thank God for them, even though I know the odds are stacked against them. I am a public school person. But it's amazing, all of a sudden, everybody's paying attention to education. Because we're wondering, how did we get in this situation we are in the United States? And we are living with the product of the last 50 years of our educational system. It's all around us in ways we're finding it hard to comprehend. Those of us who knew the most seem shocked by how bad it got, but we should have been. And it's interesting to me, I have 2-volume history about world history from a Christian perspective, 2-volume U.S. history. I usually sell a few of them every week. It's been crazy the last month how many we've sold. And I went last Sunday to a church, and I had thought I had planned out the books for the next 5 meetings, and everything sold on, all the history books sold on Sunday morning. I mean, not what I had planned for that meeting, I mean everything I had planned. And then, so I restocked and sold almost everything Sunday morning again. And the interest is everywhere. And I think it's really important that we learn to understand this, because I want to suggest to you, most folks are saying, how did we get these crazy people in our educational system? We got to do something to get these crazy people out of the system. Can I suggest to you, yes, there are some crazy people. The problem is the system. And not just the fact you have some loud, crazy people right now. Let's talk and look about it a little bit. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I just pray you'd help us to be clear and to be able to present this to these folks in a way easy to be understood. Help us to get the message and the lesson of this, and we'll thank you for it in Jesus' name. First of all, we're going to talk about the United States, so let's go back to the colonial era. In the beginning, the early decades of colonial history of the United States was famous for not being educated at all. Early writings about that, early 1700s, said that only about 50% of the men in the colonies could even read, and less than 5% of the women. See, why was that? Because all of their time and attention was on the subject of survival. When it takes everything you can do to survive, you don't go to school. And you're not involved in reading books and all the rest of that. So it was all about survival in the early days of colonies. However, 1720s, the Great Awakening came, it swept England, but it swept the colonies as well. It is incredible, the preaching of the gospel, the number of people that trusted Christ. And as people trusted Christ, they began to want to read the Bible. Literacy was sparked by the desire to read the book. And when you said the book, everybody knew what book you meant.
Yes.
It was the King James Bible.
Yes.
Even, I'm an old Westerns fan. Y'all have to forgive me. I'm just an old Westerns fan. And even today, if you're watching Westerns produced in the 40s and the 50s, they'll say the book. And everybody knew who you were talking about.
Yes.
And literacy just grew and grew. By 1770s, over 90% of men in the colonies could read. And over 50% of the women, because they would read the book. Education became an important part as the very time that the country was being founded. And there were primarily 3 forms of education. Homeschooling, churches had schools, and communities created schools. And the school in that community would reflect the values of that community. Often a community would be largely a Christian denomination, so a school would reflect Lutheranism or Congregationalism or Presbyterianism or whatever the dominant group in that community was. But virtually all education was Christian education. Went to school. It might differ whether you were in a Lutheran town on some details or whether you were in a Presbyterian town. But everybody learned the Bible was the Word of God. Everybody learned the moral code laid down in the Scriptures was the proper moral code. It was thought essential that every child get that. Did you understand? The cry of our day until recently was, we must be neutral about morality. But it's an impossibility. Somebody says homosexuality is perversion. Somebody else says it's normal. How do you get to be neutral about that? What's the neutral position? Morality is not a neutral issue. But Christian morality was taught no matter what form of education you had. Certain truths, that God was the creator. That was so commonly believed that when our founders produced the Declaration of Independence, they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator. That was something they all had in common. They believed in creation. But by the way, you get in trouble in a nation when there's not something that all the people have in common.
Right.
And man, are we at that point in our nation today. Well, community schools, homeschools, church schools represented some form of Christianity, generic Christianity, denominational Christianity, but the basic worldview of Christianity was common in education. That was the United States. That developed that way. It wasn't long until people began to challenge that and wonder about that and suggest that there was a better way to do this. And as early as the 1830s, the concept of public schools began to develop in the United States almost 200 years ago. Now, the earliest public schools, rather than being the center of society and culture, were kind of outliers that seemed strange. James Madison once wrote, somebody had indicated that it ought to be put in the Constitution to protect people from government schools. And James Madison wrote, said, what kind of a person would trust the government to teach their children? He couldn't conceive that was going to happen. There's no need to write that down. Who would do that? By the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, there were a lot of folks advocating for public schools, and they all had one thing in common. They believed in socialism, and that socialism could be the answer to all economic and societal problems. One of the first attempts was in Indiana at the New Harmony settlement. You still will see the remnants of that settlement today. And a man named Robert Owen founded it. And everybody was going to own everything in common. Common storehouse, and do your work, raise your crops, produce your goods, you bring it to the common storehouse, and then you take out of the common storehouse whatever it is you wanted. Lasted less than a year. You can figure that out, can't you? Lasted less than a year. However, his teaching about education hung on. We'll address some of all that business about socialism tomorrow night. In 1830, he wrote, "Now, in the effects of religion, as it had been hitherto taught and impressed upon the human race, shall be followed through all their ramifications, it will be discovered that the religion of the world is a sole cause of all the disunion, hatred, uncharitableness, and crime which pervade the population of the earth." He said, all of our problems come from religion. Same cry you're hearing today, by the way. It's not new, 190 years later. And he said, by creating public schools, which were founded on the original idea of socialism, when in the beginning all the rest of socialism got rejected, people hung on to the idea of a common public school. And Owen taught that as the public school replaced religion, it would solve all the problems of the world. How did they get people to buy that? Free schools. So you don't have to do the work. You don't have to pay for it. Without asking, well, where does the money the government is going to use to pay for it come from? Right. All of socialism advocated by the lure of the free. Yes. His son would write this. Robert Dale Owen. "I believe in a national system of equal, Republican, protective, practical education, the sole regenerator of a prolific age, and the only redeemer of our suffering country from the equal curses of chilling poverty and corrupting riches, of gnawing want and destroying debauchery, of blind ignorance and unprincipled intrigue." He said that's a solution to all of our problems. Free public education. By the way, that is still the cry of the public school movement. That everything can be solved by the public school and in art by spending more money or imposing more of your will. Some years ago, I was asked to participate in a debate out in Colorado. And I used to do some debating, and I sort of liked debating if you had rules. Debate without rules is just people yelling. Whoever's loudest wins, and that's not exciting to me at all. But I did some debates when we had rules, and there we had rules. They were going to be debating the importance of public education versus Christian education. There were going to be 3 public school educators, 3 people involved in Christian education. And we were paired off. I was asked to be the person representing Christian education in the first debate. Lady representing public education spoke first, and she began to list all the social problems, particularly the crime rates in the United States. Said we've got to be willing to spend on public education whatever it takes. Did that. So that was the answer. More effective public education. So then it was my turn. I'm not always the most tactful person, and I was even less so then. So I said, I just want one question. I said, all those folks that are in prison that you were talking about, where did they go to school? Were they produced by the Christian schools or by your public schools? And almost without exception, you know what the answer to that is. So I said, why would we want to spend more money on the program that produced all these folks that you were talking about? Horace Mann, called the father of the public schools, wrote, "The common school is the greatest discovery ever made by man. We repeat it, the common school is the greatest discovery ever made by man. Let the common school be expanded to its capabilities, Let it be worked with the efficiency of which it is susceptible, and 9/10 of the crimes in the penal code will become obsolete. There won't be more crime. He'd gone right, so there won't be any more poverty. But he said the concept of putting everybody together in the same school, receiving the same education, will solve all of our problems. As I said at the beginning, our problem is not just that we have some crazy public school teachers. We do. We also have some wonderful public school teachers. The problem is the system that says a common education can solve the problems of society. Because the truth is, every culture has to have a source of authority. And if that source of authority is just we're all going to learn the same thing, it's whatever the cry of the educators is at the moment. Did you see just Saturday? All around the United States, I believe Maryland was an example, all around the United States, public school teachers unions had public meetings in response to the fact that many states are trying to outlaw critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is not, and this is what they keep saying, well, people need to know about slavery and all that. It's not teaching that slavery existed. That's been in our history books since the Civil War. It's in my history books. It's in the history books I had when I was a kid. Critical race theory says that there's something genetic about white people that causes them to be oppressors. Critical race theory is teaching that we have a race problem because of the genetic code of white people. And as you might not be surprised, all around the country, people say, wait a minute, I'm not sending my kids to school so that you can teach them there's something genetically wrong with them. And that's why state legislatures, right and left, are outlawing critical race theory. But public school teachers had meetings all around the country. They say, we demand that you teach this, because said if young people do not understand this, they won't understand the history of the United States. They won't be able to know how to correct any of our problems, how to make up for any of our problems. They said we would be deceiving our young people if we did not teach them about the oppressive nature of white people. That's common education right now. That's not what common education has always meant, but all of a sudden that's common education right now. And everybody has to have a moral code. Can't just say, we don't decide whether we have a moral code or not. We're just all neutral. I was in a debate at IUPUI one time, was asked to debate a professor there. And the core of the debate was, is there such a thing as absolute rights and wrong? And he'd get 3 minutes, I get 3 minutes, he'd get 3 minutes, I get 3 minutes. No matter what I said, his answer was, who's to say what's right and wrong? I'd want to make my point as well as I could, and he'd respond, who's to say what's right or wrong? To be honest with you, it's irritating me after a while. Finally, my turn again. I said, sir, would you tell me what kind of car you drove to the meeting tonight? He said, what's that got to do with anything? I said, humor me. What kind of car? He told me the make and model. I said, what color? He told me the color. I said, when this debate's over, I'm going to go out and get the tire iron out of my car and go out and smash out your front windshield. He said, are you crazy? I said, who's to say what's right or wrong? If that's the principle, you can't tell me I'm wrong to smash out your window. No culture lives in a vacuum. No culture lives without a moral code, and no education takes place without being based on a moral code, right or wrong. So what's the moral code of the moment? The exaltation of homosexuality and perversion. Not just the tolerance of it. That lasted only briefly. The exaltation of it. Just to give you an idea, I've been involved in fighting for religious liberty for Bible colleges for a long time. Was in a battle in Indiana, led the battle in Florida. I'm involved in a battle in Illinois right now. For the fourth time, Brother Mark, fourth year in a row, this just happened. Our legislation passed this, Illinois State Senate unanimously. And the House refused to allow it to be voted on. Fourth year in a row. Just last Friday. I guess the Friday before. And they had a public hearing on it in the Senate, as they always do. And several of us were there from Bible colleges to speak to this. We don't believe the state should regulate Bible colleges. And the Board of Education always sends somebody to make the case that the state should regulate colleges. And I always knew this is what they really meant. They never said it. So, this year. Said we cannot allow Bible colleges to be unregulated because some of them might not accept homosexual students. And said we cannot allow that in the state of Illinois. Okay? Nobody operates without a moral code for very long. If you remove the Bible as a basis for your moral code, you have to replace it with something else. I wonder why there's such furious attention to the issue of transgenderism, which is less than 1/10 of 1% of the American population. It doesn't involve that many people. Why is it such an important cause to all of them? Because it sends the message. God does not decide. That is a message that a whole lot of them are determined must be sent. They're so determined it must be sent that they want to fire teachers that believe that men and women are determined, nature's determined biologically, or that only women have babies. Do you ever think you get a point where that was controversial? See, how serious is this? In the latest tax code presentation, there's a reference not to mothers, I'm talking federal tax code, but birthing persons.
Yes.
Because we do not want it said that men or women have to be a certain gender. Because that would mean God decided what your gender was. And we are going to decide for ourselves, no matter how ridiculous that is. Well, Horace Mann said, public schools, a common education, make sure everybody gets the same education, will solve all of our problems. Crime will vanish, poverty will vanish. Debate I was talking about Colorado, that was the argument of all three of them. We need to see to it that all of our children are taught the same thing. Common public education. He called it the greatest discovery ever. Not Christianity, not capitalism, not freedom. Another statement from Horace Mann. The long catalog of human ills would be abridged. Men would walk more safely by day. Every pillow would be inviolable by night. Property, life, and character held by a stronger tenure. All rational hopes respecting the future brightened. And he got his common public schools everywhere in the United States as the critical foundation part of our culture that virtually every young person shared in common. Francis Wright, socialist, public school educator, wrote, rational education is to be free for all at the expense of all, conducted under the guardianship of the state, for the honor, the happiness, the virtue, the salvation of the state. Fix your eyes upon the great object, the salvation and regeneration of humankind by means of the rational education and protection of youth. When I was a young man in high school, very, very prominent, famous teacher named Marshall McLuhan. Certainly was not a Christian. He did not respect Christianity, but he also was not blinded by the establishment around him. He was an interesting man. He refused to speak to a group larger than 12 at any time. He says nobody gets it when you have more than 12 people in the room. Unusual man. Very influential man. He wrote, "When you consider the awesome potential of our public schools to educate our children, aren't you glad they don't?" You know what his point was? In our public school system, the kids go there and rarely learn anything. They don't go. Listen to the conversations in the hallway of a public school. Nobody's discussing education. It is a social gathering. I know I was there. I get it. I can't think of very much that I learned in the public school system. You know why you went? Had to. That's where your friends were. Nobody went because they wanted to learn science or math or history. And there may have been a few, but they were by far the exception. Marshall McLuhan's point was the reason the public schools are not doing us even more harm than they have is the kids aren't listening. There's some truth to that. People ask me how I escaped the public school system without my Christianity being damaged or even bothered by it. In retrospect, I think because I didn't pay attention. I knew that was there, but I wasn't listening to it or anything else. Orestes Brownson, another leader in this socialist public school. Do you understand? The demand for public schools was a socialist demand from the beginning. He wrote, "The great object was to get rid of Christianity and to convert our churches into halls of science. The plan was not to make open attacks on religion, although we might belabor the clergy, bring them into contempt where we could, but to establish a system of state. We said national schools, from which all religion was to be excluded, which nothing was to be taught, but such knowledge as is verifiable by the census, to which all parents would be compelled by law to send their children to learn." The whole concept of the public schools was to replace Christian culture, which was the culture all over this brand new country. Not everybody bought it. In 1892, the Kansas Teachers Union, the Teachers Union, wrote this: "American education was nurtured in the lap of the church. The study of the Bible is to be secluded from all state schools. If the inculcation of the principles of Christianity is to have no place in the daily program, if the worship of God is to form no part of the general exercises of these public elementary schools, then the good of the state would be better served by restoring all schools to church control." He said, we're not teaching the truth. Let's just send these kids back to having schools run by the church. Teachers Union. I wouldn't count on anything similar to that from a teachers union today. What happened? More and more, this public school movement, Christianity infiltrated the public schools, took it over, community standards were respected, teachers were often open about their Christianity, and all the way through the course of this, Christianity began to be merged with the public schools. It was an amazing thing. I come along just at the end of that era to be in the public schools. I'll say more about that in a bit. There were some private schools, but the truth was most Christian parents and most Christian parents kind of went to sleep and relaxed because they were sending their kids to public schools, and pretty much they were getting what they wanted. The weakness of the conservative Christian movement is we're incredibly naive. We win one election and we go to sleep because we think everything is over. We stop one piece of legislation and we think all our problems are solved. Or we get a piece of good legislation and we think we can relax. The other side are in a lifetime battle. They lose a battle, they start going after it again tomorrow morning. They lose an election, they begin the next campaign tomorrow. If they don't get the legislation they want, they just introduce it in a new name. They never back down. They never accept a defeat as permanent. Consequently, conservatives win the 2016 elections pretty solidly. And by 2018, we give everything back to them. Because we went to sleep. They didn't. Well, Christianity began to exert more and more influence in the public schools, and Christian parents even were happier and happier until 1963. The progressives understood they could not allow this Christian influence in the public schools. They sponsored court cases, took them to the Supreme Court, because they knew Congress would never be brave enough to outlaw Christianity in the public schools. They took them to the Supreme Court. Very, very influential person among these educators was John Dewey. John Dewey wrote, "I believe that the teacher is engaged not simply in the training of individuals, but in the formation of proper social life. Every teacher should realize the dignity of his calling, that he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of proper social order, securing of the right social growth." You thought he was there to teach science and math. So in this way, the teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usher in of the true kingdom of God. It's a religious purpose. All education is religious. And all education has a religious purpose. If you do not have Christian education, you have to replace it with some other form of education. You could replace it with Muslim education. You can replace it with Hindu education. You can replace it with pagan education. And that is indeed what has happened in our country and our setting. Dewey also writes, in conclusion, we may say that the conception of the school as a social center is born of our entire democratic movement. Everywhere we see signs of the growing recognition that the community owes to each one of its members the fullest opportunities for development. Everywhere we see the growing recognition that the community life is defective and distorted, except as it does thus care for all its constituent parts. This is no longer viewed as a matter of charity, but as a matter of justice. A necessary phrase of developing growing life. Men will long dispute about material socialism. About socialism considered as a matter of distribution of the material resources in the community. But there is socialism regarding which there can be no such dispute. Socialism of the intelligence and of the spirit. Economically, socialism is the government, either ownership or control of production. Educationally, socialism is government as the arbitrator of education. And when they could not win socialism in the political debates, they won it in the educational system.
Right.
When I was pastoring at one point in Indiana when there was a considerable debate going on about prayer in the public schools. Radio station called, wanted to know if I believed in prayer in the public schools. I said no, but you have to let me define my answer. It's not the prayer I don't believe in. It's a public school. The concept doesn't work, even when there are good people in it trying to do their best, because it's the wrong concept. So let's get rid of some of these crazy teachers, then we will still have a system that doesn't work, maybe with less crazy teachers. When I pastored a small town right outside Indianapolis. City of Indianapolis absorbed the town. The town elected me to represent them to the Indianapolis City County Council as all these things were changing, and I was involved in a number of things you would consider political. We had some success getting some things done. Local Republican leaders came and said, "We think you should run for office. We would back you if you ran for political office." I said, "No, you wouldn't." They said, "Yes, we would." I said, "What would you do when in the first time in a debate, somebody asked what I would do about the public schools, and I said I would close them?" I never heard from them again, ever, because I really knew they wouldn't back me. See, but it's the essence of everything. Seriously? To Christians, it's the essence of everything? It's just a source of all knowledge. Really? To Christians, government, education is the source of all knowledge?
No.
Another progressive, Nicholas Murray Butler, who was president of Columbia University when he wrote this. To lay the basis for scientific theory of education, considered as a human institution. The process of education is explained from the standpoint of the doctrine of evolution. He said, we have to provide a philosophy of education for all of our young people. Because it's a public school, they often get the same thing. So where do we start? Theory of evolution. The fundamental principles thus arrived at are applied from the threefold standpoint of the history of civilization, the developing powers of the child, and the cultivation of individual societal efficiency. He went on to say that the entire concept of a common public school must be consistent with evolution in every classroom. Another progressive wrote, Colonel F.W. Parker. The child is not in school to learn, not in there for mere knowledge, but he is there to live, to learn to live, not a preparation for life so much as real living. The pupil should learn in school to live. He should then put himself into life. The teacher is the leader in this community life. Self-government is only true government. A child should be taught to live for others. We are too apt to ignore the divinity of a child. I go on. Y'all get the idea? I happen to be in school, started elementary school. We had prayer every morning. Teacher read Bible every morning. My third grade teacher prayed for every student in the class by name that each one of us would trust Christ. And incidentally, a couple of years later, I get picked up by a church bus and taken to church, and I trust Christ just the way she prayed. So that's the deciding factor. I don't put all the pieces of the puzzle of the universe together, but it sure didn't hurt me to have a public school teacher praying for me that I'd be saved. I was in public school, and I came home one day, and there it was on the news. The Supreme Court said, no more prayer, no more Bible reading. Because see, the socialist progressive educators were not accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish because Christianity was infiltrating the public schools from every angle you could imagine, and they weren't getting what they wanted. He said, we've got to get the Bible, and we've got to get Christianity out of the schools. Otherwise, we'll never be able to create this common culture. So ask the Supreme Court to do it. 9 people made the decision to change, and not unanimously, made the decision to change our entire culture. I remember watching the news broadcast. Wonder what was going to happen next day. Went in, read the Bible, prayed. That went on for a year and a half. Till finally, under pressure from the federal government, because a big part, even of local education, is paid for by federal dollars. And finally got to a place where the schools were going to lose their federal dollars. They, probably somewhat reluctantly, but they said, we can't do prayer and Bible study anymore. Same teacher that had prayed for all of her students by name that they would be saved, refused to stop having prayer and Bible study. She was in the news for about another year and a half, till finally she was prosecuted for violating the law. I would go on and attend the second largest public high school in the United States at that time, 1967, 1971. Largest was in Chicago. I attended high school in the United States with over 5,000 students. It really was a social center. Everything I ever learned about drugs, I learned on that campus. There were 4 teens killed there during my first 3 semesters. The social pressures towards immorality, bad language, and promiscuity were tremendous. It was the last place on earth I want to send someone to as a social center. Well, parents said, I want my children to have every opportunity. Every opportunity for what? If you look around right now in this country, we are living with the results of what has been taught in our public schools for the last 50 years. I've been saying this for most of that time. Kind of to, yeah, sure, reaction. Now all of a sudden, everybody's paying attention. Because if you look around, I mean, you just saw, latest round of this, a public school board just voted. I forget where now, they just voted. We're not going to mention in our school calendar the names of the holidays because it might cause people heartache to read about Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter. We're just going to say time off. My answer to that, they said, we don't want to offend anybody. What about the people who are offended by not having Christmas?
Right.
And just today, Flag Day. And there were comments about public school educators talking about how they were offended at the flag. And again, somebody said we shouldn't put the flag out because it offends some people. What about those of us who are offended by not putting the flag out? Do we count? And you think, I know you, yes we do. No, we don't. Now, having said all that, the United States was founded on Christian education, built on it. It faded. Then it made a comeback infiltrating the new public school education. Then they got the Supreme Court, get out of public schools. Follow-up to that was a new Christian education movement. All across the United States, local churches started Christian schools, concerned parents formed organizations at Christian schools. Many parents began to homeschool children. And Christian school curriculum developed all over the country. At least a dozen companies producing Christian school curriculum. I've written a few on history. It's not a majority by any stretch of imagination, but it does provide the option of not being taught by all the folks who are teaching all the crazy things today. Legal battles have been fought about the freedom to have Christian education, and so far we have been winning those battles pretty consistently around the country. So much so that in some states there isn't much pressure to stop it. However, we've reached a new moment. There is a new issue that is going to be the issue. Okay, have your Christian school, teach the Bible, have chapel. Just one thing. You cannot teach homosexuality is sin. See, that could never happen. I mean, couldn't. It has. Did you know Joe Biden's first week as president, he issued an order that all of the Christian colleges that take government money could no longer have separate bathrooms? And most Christian colleges in the last 20 years have started taking government money. And if they have in their dormitories, they cannot have separate showers for men and women. So his first week in office. And you see, that hadn't been enforced. Hadn't been enforced because immediately a Christian college, Bible College of the Ozarks, filed a lawsuit against the government in order to get that overturned. In the first round, they lost. They are in the second round. But understand this already. Christian colleges, Bible colleges that take government money, which is almost all of them. Not Dayspring Bible College, by the way. We still have a handful of old-fashioned fanatics at Dayspring that don't believe the government has any business in education. And if you think it's going to finance it without controlling it, you just live in a fantasy world.
Right.
So that decree doesn't apply to us. We're not in defiance of it because we don't take government money, so it doesn't affect us. That's just a commercial thrown in for free. This is the battle of the moment. You can have your Christian education as long as you reflect President Obama referred to it as our basic American values, by which he meant the acceptance of the normalcy of homosexuality. And, of course, now, acceptance of the genetic inferiority of white people, and acceptance of the idea that America has been the most wicked, terrible, horrible, oppressive society in the history of the world. I'm not going to quit there, because that's a little discouraging. If you think they're not coming after every form of education to insist on instilling those things, you can be sure they are. So what do we do? Well, let me say a few things real quickly. First of all, I do not live in a fantasy world. I am quite sure some young people are going to still end up in public schools, even though I don't want them to be there. If you have to have your children or grandchildren in public school, do not be naive. Read their textbooks. Talk to them consistently about what they're learning. Correct their teachers and their curriculum whenever they contradict the Bible. Preaching in church one time, and I said something about some of the wickedness of public education, what was being taught. And a lady came up to me angry. She said, "How dare you say that about our public schools? Our public schools, our teachers are all Christians. They're here to," right? They would never teach that. They would never allow that. But her son had been at church kind of haphazardly, wasn't really paying attention. Matter of fact, he brought his homework to do during the preaching, which meant he had a textbook with him. And while he's listening to his mother yell at me, he walks up with his textbook. Says, "Mom, it's right here." Don't be naive. Do everything you can to get the proper information to young people who are going to be in public schools. When you have a chance, raise a voice. It does sometimes make a difference. School board meetings, school board elections, community meetings. Just a dear friend of mine from my youth, he's the president of the city county council of a city in the Midwest. He just sets the agenda, what the city county council votes on. Mayor came in and said, "I want the city county council to designate," it was just last week, "I want to designate this week Gay Pride Week." This man's a Christian, graduate of a Christian college. And he said, "No." He said, I put on the agenda what gets voted on. That's not going to be voted on. So the mayor, ignoring the city county council, made his own designation as an individual. This is Gay Pride Week. And told him, he said, "I will see to it you never win an election in this town again." And my friend properly responded, "If you can do that, do it. But I'm going to stand for what's right." He said, "I think you're going to be surprised how many people in this town will stand for what's right." I hope he's correct. Where we have the chance to raise a voice, raise a voice. Time politicians heard. Are you ready? Time some Republican politicians heard that we conservatives are not going to vote for them if they support this kind of thing. Like it or not, some of them, it's the only thing they care about. Years back when we were fighting for religious liberty for Bible colleges in Florida. And I tell that story and people usually think we were fighting liberal Democrats. It was the Jeb Bush administration. And they threatened to put the president of a Bible college in jail for not allowing his Bible college to be regulated by state. They put him in prison. Sent him a letter. Said, "You cease and desist immediately or you will be arrested." So I called the governor's office. Didn't get the governor, but called the governor's office. Said, "It's interesting," because they said, "The ball's in your court now. You told them to quit. They're not going to. Who's going to do the arresting? State police, county police? You're going to file a lawsuit? The ball's in your court now. What are you going to do?" They said, "He has to shut down." We sent him a letter. I said, "You don't know much about Baptist history. Our guys have been crucified, burned at the stake, fed to wild animals, beheaded, faced firing squads. We don't necessarily jump because we got a letter in the mail." Long story short, they didn't do anything. And I went on to say, "By the way," I said, "Governor Bush might want to ask himself this question." I said, "If you put him in jail, I'm going to go run that college. If you put me in jail, we already have the next person set up to go run that college. And the person after that. said Governor Bush might want to ask how many Republicans he wants to arrest during election year. We never heard from them again. Eventually got the law changed, but they never contacted us again after that. Raise a voice when you can. And then support Christian education every way you possibly can as individuals and as a church. Every church situation is different. Every community is different. I am not telling you how to do it, but every way that you possibly can, support Christian education. If they have not got our attention now with the stuff that you're seeing every single day, what exactly would it take to get our attention? If they haven't got it now. Don't miss this moment. Say, boy, it's just terrible. It's just terrible. God put us here for this moment. I will say this. I don't know if it's enough or not. All over the country, the last few weeks, parents have been rising up in school board meetings, in community meetings, in pulling their children out of the public school system. There has been a wave of standing up to this that, frankly, I didn't expect. So is it big enough to change anything? I don't know. Let's find out. It want to be said we sat back and watched. Get the best information you can to children trapped in the public schools. Raise a voice whenever you can. Let's do everything as individuals and as pastors and churches that we possibly can to provide good Christian education for our young people. God bless you.